One noted anthropologist says it's now an overused cliche to speak of the woman forced to make hard choices between work and home, forced to choose between new and traditional roles. Faced with such conflicts, this anthropologist says, many women survive by ingenious and original ways of combining and harmonizing aspects of their lives. While their roles may continue to differ, the underlying themes of their lives remain the same. Because of this, the idea of home as a place to give and receive nurture might become a new metaphor for the workplace. The anthropologist who is saying these things is my guest in this broadcast. Join me with Catherine Bateson.
This program is made possible by a grant from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. A World of Ideas with Bill Moyers.
Catherine Bateson studies change and lives it. How to think in new ways about our problems is a theme of her work and a daily challenge in her personal life. She's a scholar, author, wife, and mother. She has taught anthropology at Amherst, Northeastern, and Harvard, as well as abroad, and soon she will begin teaching at George Mason University in Virginia. Her books range from the social consequences of the AIDS epidemic to life with her celebrated parents, the anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. Now she's working on a book about women. The title is Composing a Life, and the theme is how women make order and sense out of their conflicting commitments. At the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, where Catherine Bateson occasionally serves as a lay preacher, we talked about how women and men can change their way of thinking about change. You're suggesting in so much of your work that we have to change how we think, what we call the problems we're facing in this modern world. Is that right?
Yeah. You know, one of the problems I think in this society is that the things that work in the short term don't work in the long term. There's a sort of parable I like to use for this. I mean, you probably heard of the Iditarod, which is this sled dog race across Alaska. It's more than 1,000 miles of somebody driving a sled pulled by dogs. It lasts nearly 2 weeks. It is as races go. And for the last 3 years, it's been won by a woman named Susan Butcher. And you ask the question, how is it that she has won? Now, I've never talked to her. I've just read what she said in the papers. But the answer is that whereas her chief competitor starts his dogs early and drives them hard, they get tired at the end of the day. So every day, he forges ahead of her, and at the end of the day, his dogs are getting tired, and she's catching up. She wins the race essentially by not exploiting her dogs, by not exhausting them. Now, if the race only lasted 2 days, he would always win. If the race lasted a week, he would always win. The race is long enough so that the caring and protection that she lavishes on her dogs turns into a winning strategy. Now, you see, we've organized our society so that the winning strategies are the short-term ones. We have taught ourselves not to think in terms of the long haul. But the long haul is what lies between now and a decent life for our grandchildren. Sometimes I think, I've been looking at how women organize their lives and their careers. Sometimes I think that it may be helpful as more women come into full participation at higher policy levels, and they're not there yet, that we may get more of this kind of long-term thinking.
What makes you think women can bring this sensitivity to the workplace?
At the moment, every adult woman is marked by child rearing that assumed genuinely different roles in the society for men and women. Now, we don't know what kind of differences would remain between men and women if this were not true. But in any case, this is our situation at the moment, where we have a population where even within the same family, individuals have been differently shaped. And nobody, of course, is shaped to express all of their potentials. Now, there's a lot of evidence of women functioning very much like men, doing what men do, seeking the same kinds of narrow and short-term goals that men have been taught to seek, and often being rather unhappy doing it. But you know, the men may be a little unhappy sometimes too. Now, one of the things that strikes me, you know, we talk now about the terrible conflict that women are in between work and the home, and how terrible it is to be torn in two directions. Women have always been torn. We forget that sometimes.
Always?
We forget that when a woman who's been married for a period of time gives birth to a baby, she has to serve two masters. She has to respond to two different kinds of needs. And then she has a second baby. You know, we talk about sibling rivalry. She's got one baby at the breast and one baby on her knee, and they're quite likely to be quarreling. So that the traditional feminine roles as wife and mother of multiple children have involved caring for multiple issues, balancing them off, not neglecting this while you're caring about this, having one rhythm to respond to a husband, another one with an infant, another one with a growing child. This is what it is to be a woman. And this is what it is to keep a household going, to have multiple skills, to deal with transitions, to deal with the health of the whole. Now, you go out of a home, you go into a corporation or into a factory, you may spend all day thinking of only one factor in a complex situation. There is a sense in which women have retained the capacity to be generalists, the capacity to live in an ecology in which there is more than one life, more than one form of adaptation, and you have to balance them off. Whereas far too many men, and this of course has increased with the modern period, have been narrowed to caring for only one thing. But what if the health of the world depends on the same kind of capacity that allows you to see, while you're looking after one, you're feeding one child, that the other child is reaching up and about to pull a cooking pot of hot liquid on his head, and you whip around. This capacity to see out of the corner of your eye and care about the health not just of one child, or a husband and other members of the family. That is the beginning of the capacity to care about the health of a multitude of nations, or an environment of many species.
True, but if the female is rewarded for the next quarter's profit and success, compensatory to the man's reward What makes you think you wouldn't start thinking as he does, with that singularity of vision to deliver those profits and make that factory run on time? The reward could change the behavior.
I might. And that's why this period is so important.
In what way? What do you mean?
Because we are at a period where the entry of women into full participation, still carrying with them the experience of having been socialized for other kinds of roles.
Nurturing,
Caring has a potential for changing the tone overall. I can't guarantee that that moment will go on forever. But because I am quite sure that we are in deep danger of really wrecking our environment and wrecking the future of this country if we can't learn to think in this more complex way. I believe that it is exactly those women who are, in a sense, migrating from one role to another, even if they've been professionally busy since they got out of college. I don't mean just women who've been full-time housewives, but women who have included these different ways of seeing in their past. This is a moment, maybe the best moment of opportunity we'll ever have to find that potential for longer-term thinking that, after all, is there in men, too. They don't have to go around with blinkers on. I mean, I really...
But we're paid well to do so.
Well, you are. But then you pay yourselves to do so, too.
What do you mean?
I mean, the people making the decisions of who to pay are also men.
Well, power dictates its own rewards, its own returns, its own behavior. And women are going to be susceptible to the rewards, the power, and therefore the behavior, don't you think?
I think it is a matter of shifting gear, and it's going to be hard to do, to longer-term thinking. It's a situation like the Iditarod.
The race.
The race that I talked about across Alaska, where the longer-term strategy wins unless you set the rules in such a way as to make it lose all the time. This, in a sense, is the fundamental problem of our society, to find a way to reverse the process that's taking place at the moment of narrowing and making more and more specialized, and affirm a broader and longer-term way of thinking.
But even now, Catherine, men are allowed to feel at home when they're at work. You know what I mean? Whereas women, even when they're allowed into the marketplace, into the workplace, are not yet allowed to feel at home there. What do you find that so?
Oh, absolutely.
And why is that?
Know exactly what this... Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. And I think it's one of the great ironies, because, of course, the whole rhetoric of home and work was based on the notion that you go to work and you go home and relax, which, of course, women have never been able to do, because they can't relax when they go home. And then they go to the workplace, and they discover the same men that they've been bringing the slippers to, putting their feet up on their desks, and they can't do that either. But it's an uncomfortable transition. Women in the workplace still make men nervous. It's still harder to listen. It's still harder to hear what women say. It's a long, slow process. But I think what's important is to understand that this is not simply a matter of fairness to women, which is, of course, very important. This is a matter of providing the maximum richness of creative input in our society.
What about the woman who's caught in the midst of this transition, who's been for 20 or 25 years a housewife? What have 20 years, 25 years of being a housewife prepared a woman to do?
Well, the question basically is, what does the personnel officer she talks to think those years have prepared her to do? Because in fact, she's had a great deal of experience and maturing, and she's juggled a lot of stuff, and she has a lot of potential skills. It's a matter of your classification system. After World War II, when the GIs came home and went to college on the GI Bill, everybody said what wonderful students they were because of the years they'd spent in the Army. Now, they didn't say that knowing how to fly an airplane has made this student good at studying philosophy. And they didn't say that driving a truck has made this student wonderful at mathematics. The converse might be true. They said that dealing with the complexity and the experience and the maturing of those years made them able to learn. Right? Now, I think women who have been housewives, the kind of group that's talked about as displaced homemakers who were forced into the labor market at midlife, who incidentally are largely middle and upper class women, because the poorer women have been out there for years, that they are only, well, that they are still struggling for the definitions of experience and the acceptance of those definitions that will let them perform at their optimum. You know, I mean, here were these women who were taught, as women of my generation learned as children, that if they did not have a job for which they earned money, when somebody asked them at a party, "What do you do?" the correct answer was, "Oh, I don't do anything. I'm just a housewife." This is learned, a learned classification system, and it is obviously not true, because they've always worked very hard.
What about those people, many of them women, and often for religious reasons, who want to keep the traditional role for females? They really honestly believe that what you're talking about will undermine the very fabric of a caring society by undoing all the models that keep us in place, keep us secure.
There is no reason why it should not be a possible decision to stay at home as a full-time homemaker and caretaker for children. If we want freedom, that freedom has to exist also. Many women don't have that alternative, and so there is the question of fairness and indeed survival for women who must earn to support their children. Beyond that, there is the question of freedom and creativity to allow a range of possibilities for the women who are motivated to pursue a different kind of life. I would hope that the women who care about the traditional roles would also allow freedom of choice to the women who are exploring new roles. Now, you know, I lived for a number of years in Iran. And at the time that I went to Iran, what we saw was a society where women were gradually increasing their participation, although nowhere near comparable to the level that now exists in this country. And what we now see, following the revolution, is that women have been forced out of certain kinds of participation in public life. They're back wearing the veil, back very much constrained to a domestic life. It's amazing that change can happen so fast.
Either way.
Either way. But when I was there, I always had a soft spot for the women at the pivot generation. And what do you do if you're 45 or 50 and you've never been outside of your house without a veil, and you've never earned independently, and indeed you've never gone and traveled to another city or stayed in a hotel without someone looking after you? What do you do if all of a sudden you are told that you cannot wear the veil, that you must go out? This is terrifying. And it's also terrifying to lose one set of privileges and protections and not have the skills and confidence you need to claim the next ones. There are women like that. They're the same. What I'm trying to say is the women in that situation who were arguing against the ERA in the United States are in the same dilemma of being part in one life and part in the other as the women in Iran who welcomed the Ayatollah so they could put their veils back on and be locked up again. You sympathize with the dilemma of being caught between the past and the future, and wanting the past because it feels safer and more protective and more familiar. But I would always put my efforts on the side of letting people take off the veils and go out of the door and live a broader life.
You've done that. You have had 4 or 5 careers. You are an anthropologist, professor, a scholar, a writer, a mother, a wife. You've lived abroad. You've traveled with your husband. You have composed a fortunate life. What does it take? What lessons are there for other women?
I see other women in my situation. One of the reasons I've had so many careers is because I've adapted to my husband's career changes and often started again when we went to new places.
You went to the Philippines with him. You went to Iran with him.
That's right, and had to find a job that made sense. It occurred to me that I could think of that as a terrible problem, as a terrible burden, to have to start again so many times, as so many women do have to. And then it occurred to me that the most creative people I know are the people who have done one thing for a while and then shifted gears and done something else, as you know yourself, Bill. And that these discontinuities, you can look at them as a burden, or you can look at them as a stimulus to creativity. And the same thing is true about conflicting commitments. I mean, I know what it feels like to be in an office and be worrying about the babysitter's going to leave and what's going to happen to my child and how do I balance these things. But dealing with the conflicting commitments, trying to put them together to compose a life in which there's room for both of them, is also an important kind of creativity. So this is what I'm trying to do, is to examine these particular problems and look at the way women solve them, because I think men increasingly face the same problems. That, you know, foreclosed farmers who lose their farms are like displaced homemakers. And the same kind of thing happens to executives when their company gets bought out and, as it is said, restructured. And they're out on the street trying to think of what to do next. This is the century of the refugee. We live longer, men and women, and we have more potential discontinuities in our lives. So that the creative life is likely to involve readapting and readapting, maybe several times. It's a burden. It hurts. But you're a different person afterwards. You know something you wouldn't have known otherwise. It's like when at 6 o'clock in the evening, 4 guests turn up and your husband says, "We can feed them supper, can't we, darling?" And you go down to the kitchen and you start scrambling through the refrigerator, through the cupboards, trying to invent some combination that will make sense of the evening. Our past is full of wonderful traditions. The cupboards are full, the refrigerator is full. The situation calls on a kind of creative improvisation.
Do you think the day will come when you call home and say, "Dear, I'm bringing 4 guests home, will you have dinner?" and he moves into action?
I've done it.
He can improvise.
Yeah.
We all can. That's what you're saying.
And we all can. And we're all going to have to.
From the Dean's office at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, this has been a conversation with Catherine Bateson. I'm Bill Moyers. Years ago in the New Yorker. Mary McCarthy is a liberal writer, liberal social critic. But that diagnosis might just as well have been written by some of our leading conservative thinkers. It seems left and right today are joined in their common lament over the giant but invisible mechanism called bureaucracy. Join me for a conversation with the historian John Lucas.
This program is made possible by a grant from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. A World of Ideas with Bill Moyers.
John Lucas calls himself an early refugee from communism. In 1946, he fled his home in Hungary and came to the United States. He is now a professor of history at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia and the author of over a dozen books. Books that range from biography to politics to his most recent work, a portrait of his native Budapest at the turn of the century. 2 of his books in particular spoke to me as a journalist: The Passing of the Modern Age and Outgrowing Democracy. They analyze America's vulnerability to changes in our national character since World War II. I visited with John Lucas in his home near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to talk with him about what's been happening to his adopted country. What struck you most about America when you arrived in 1946?
America was like Europe used to be before the war. There was very little government. There was very little police. No intervention in your personal life. People let you alone sometimes to the extent that they were awfully uninterested in what you were doing. But nonetheless, this was, in a way, like a remnant of the old liberal 19th century world.
Did it take you long to become an American?
I'm an American citizen, but when I speak with other Americans, I find it difficult to say we.
Why is that? Because America is full of people like you.
I know this is part of my very old-fashioned and reactionary sentiment.
Reactionary? You're not a reactionary.
Oh, I'm a reactionary rather than a conservative.
Now, what's the difference?
Well, especially now in this country, the conservatives are just extreme progressives. They're really not interested in conserving old liberties. They are interested in making the world, or actually making the universe, safe for democracy, their brand of democracy. They are interested in development, Star Wars. They are saying they're against big government, but they're very much in favor of big government. An extreme application of the American military presence all around the world. One of the more intelligent women among them. Mrs. Schlafly said, God gave America the atom bomb. What's so conservative about this?
You once said that patriots, especially true conservatives, should be suspicious of ideology.
To be a conservative, properly speaking, should be the very opposite of an ideologue. You know, a conservative is profoundly aware of the sinful nature, the sinful essence of human nature, including that of his own country and his people. You know, a patriot wants, patriotism is essentially defensive. Nationalism is aggressive. And our conservatives are nationalists, not patriots.
Meaning?
They believe that it is the destiny and the fate of the United States to impose its values and standards and to extend its interests over vast portions of the world.
What's wrong with that?
Every nation has a particular destiny that is circumscribed by its history, by its geography, by its interests. This is not a cruel and realistic view. This involves a certain amount of humility, or at least a lack of presumption. As John Quincy Adams said, we are friends of liberty all over the world, but we are not in search for monsters to destroy.
What's your definition of a reactionary, would you call yourself?
A reactionary is somebody who thinks that the clock has to be put back sometimes.
And a conservative?
A conservative doesn't think that. Well, an American conservative now is more enamored with progress and with technical progress than liberals and progressives were 2 generations ago.
Progress?
Yes.
What kind of progress?
This is a very important question to raise because I think that the great task before all of us and our children, not only in the United States, but throughout probably most of the world, we have to rethink the meaning of progress.
What's the meaning that you think most of us now embrace?
It's a meaning that is outdated. Man's increasing mastery and government of things, beyond a point where man himself becomes a thing. We have to conserve much of the world. We have to conserve much of the past. What this world needs is not growth as much as stability.
I think if you look to the definition, you'd find that the meaning of progress is, the traditional meaning is moving toward a goal, constantly improving ourselves as we go there. And you're saying we have to change that idea of progress?
But we're not improving ourselves. Progress means constantly changing the thing, the world beyond us, without us. Not really improving our minds, not only improving ourselves. The progressive mind denies the existence of sin, of frailty, of the limitations of human nature, because what is taught in our schools and universities all over the world is that men don't have a control of their destiny, that we are programmed by genes or hormones or psychology or environment, we are more and more destitute of the sense of free will. This is part of the technological development and the mindset of an age at its very end, and this is not life-giving. This is really a very despairing view of human nature and of its capacities.
You've written that at the end of an era, people lose faith in their ability to reform institutions, to change things. Is that happening?
That's happening, and that's happening, unfortunately, in this country, many levels. Because a lot of people have the experience that the bureaucratic organization of everyday life, not only of government, but of the private institution, is such that it takes immense effort, too much trouble to be able to reform it. Now, this is true of many other countries. But this is something relatively new for the United States. The United States, even when I came to this country, was a simpler country, to some extent a cruder country.
Cruder?
A more direct country. It was easier to do some things. Very simple operations. This country was behind Europe, not only because of those freedoms I mentioned earlier, but there was less bureaucracy in this country. There is now in this country as much bureaucracy as there is in Europe, Western Europe. A very odd example. 40 years ago, about 1948, I met a Philadelphia lawyer. You know, Philadelphia lawyer used to be a term that's almost extinct now as a particular kind of lawyer, kind of on the top of the American legal profession. And he told me that when he pays his income taxes, he takes the very minimal deductions, or no deductions at all, because he knows what he owes this country, his country and his government. This impressed me very much. There is no one in Europe who would have done this ever in the history of Europe. But I also had a sad feeling that this is not going to last. And I'm sure there is no such lawyer in America now, you see. And you see, we have reached a stage of bureaucracy where, for example, a letter from your grandmother is not only as much of a historical document than a speech by a president, but it is more authentic because she wrote it herself. And we have speeches of presidents, records of cabinet deliberations, you know. I mean, memoranda, state papers that were written, dictated, and sometimes not even signed by a president. And the bureaucratic habit, the bureaucratic practice, the bureaucratic encumberments of everyday life do leave a sediment, a mark on people's minds.
In what way?
They do not become corrupt, but they become tired and skeptical. In our very township, we are fighting some mass developments now. We have less cooperation from people whose very interests are involved, to come to the township meeting, to sign petition, to do this and that. It still exists. It exists more than in Europe. It's wonderful, you know, how public opinion can influence and change things. But the people who are responsive to this are not young people.
What do you make of that? That bureaucracies do not summon citizenship the way democracy calls for citizenship. So we don't take ourselves as seriously historically as we once did.
Precisely. There's a kind of tiredness, a kind of apathy about the system. You know, and the system might be the office manager where you work. It's irrelevant whether this is General Electric, the Pentagon, or the business where you work. And this is very odd that this happens, this apathy, which is not terribly overwhelming, because the wonderful thing about this country, that it's still, not in every way, but in many fields of life, it's unpredictable. Yes. And people occasionally do take their destiny in their hands. And this is wonderful because destiny is not fate. Fate is preordained, destiny is not. But it is more rare than it was in the past. And it's very odd that this should happen at a time when, in a way, the United States won the Cold War.
Won the Cold War?
Yes.
You think we did?
If you consider the Cold War The contest between communism and what people call capitalism, well, these ideas incarnated by two great powers, Soviet Union and the United States, there's no question that what the United States represents in the world, or seems to represent in the world, is far more widespread than what the Russians represent. And finally this has come about. And in this sense, the United States won the Cold War. But, as some great moralist wrote in the past, it takes greater character to carry off good fortune than bad. What are we going to do with it?
And you think we are not certain about that?
We're not certain about it, and the wonderful thing about a certain kind of American provinciality is that many Americans don't think about this as a great triumph. And that's good. That's good, you know. I mean, it's much better that when Richard Nixon said this awful thing, that we are number one. It's a very vulgar statement.
Why?
Because when somebody has to say that he's number one, it means that he's not sure of himself.
You are saying we have won the Cold War in the sense that nobody is choosing communism today, and a lot of people are trying to pursue capitalism.
Yes, and even if it's not old-fashioned capitalism, it is the perception of a social and economic order or disorder that the United States represents. And this is very important because ideas don't exist in the abstract. They have to be incarnated by human beings. And in this respect, it's not capitalism that won the Cold War, but the United States won the Cold War.
The United States, the basic idea of which is...
Yeah, because it represents something. You know, just like the Second World War involved Nazism, or what people call fascism, but essentially it was Germany. Germany incarnated a very strong, in many ways evil, historical force, and that historical force had to be defeated. And the United States incarnates in different ways a lot of things, including this view of the world about capitalism, freedom, free economy, this and that, that very often does not quite correspond to what is really going on in this country. But in the short run, no matter. It is the United States which is imitated all over the world, including Tehran, you know, and not Russia. But such things do not last forever. If at a future time people will realize that there are many things in America that are much less free than they had thought. There are many things in America that don't function or work as well as they had thought. There will occur an erosion of prestige, irrespective what the material and military power of the United States is at that given point. And when that happens, that's a dangerous thing, because it's much more difficult to recover prestige than it is to recover power. This is as true in the life of individuals as it is in the life of nations.
But do you think our prestige at the moment is at a peak?
No, but still very, very considerable. But many things have to be done to correct and reform the functioning of American institutions, the quality of American culture, the actual results of the immense amount of money and trust we pour into education.
You've said that you don't believe Americans are being well served at the moment by their educational or informational bureaucracies. What do you mean in specific?
The trust in education is perhaps the basic American superstition. It goes back to the Puritans. But it can be exaggerated and misused by a bureaucracy, by an educational bureaucracy, and by an informational bureaucracy that in the late 20th century has begun to run along a track that is very contrary to all American tradition. Because all American tradition, to a great extent, depends and had depended on an overestimation, perhaps, of the intelligence of the people, which sometimes may be wrong, but it's not as wrong as to proceed from an underestimation of the intelligence of the people. And our educational and our informational and perhaps our entertainment bureaucracies have come to proceed from a fairly cynical underestimation of the intelligence of the common people. For example, the American people today are taught less history than before in their schools. The standards of history teaching have vastly deteriorated. The actual ignorance of some people about young people in recent history is appalling. At the same time, the American people are much more history-minded than they were 100 years ago. A publisher today will not publish, save in exceptional circumstances, a new novel, but he will publish a new history. There is an appetite for history in this country and for a sense of the past. To me, it means very much, because I think that history consists of words, because we think in words. 60 years ago in this country, the word modern was a very good word. In England, a modern girl or a modern woman was a fast woman. In America, a modern girl was an all-American girl. At the same time, in the 1920s, old-fashioned in America was a more pejorative word than in England, you know. Old-fashioned meant fuddy-duddy Victorian. Today, if you ask somebody, where would you like to live, in a modern house or an old-fashioned house? Where would you like to go for dinner? To the modern restaurant, an old-fashioned restaurant? Whom would you want your little sister to marry? Somebody from a modern family or from old-fashioned family? I would say 98 of 100 people would choose the old-fashioned. And this is a mutation of consciousness. This means something. This is more than just mere nostalgia.
What is it?
People are beginning to recognize that the past is solid, that the American consciousness is beginning to include a historical element and not merely the so-called progressive element, which very often was an escape from history.
If you are right, it is a profound change in the American psychology, because for 200 years we have been the country of the future. It is the future that beckons, the green light out on the horizon, drawing us toward that ever-increasing frontier. And now you're saying we're beginning to incorporate that the past is the future, or is a part of the landscape of the future.
It is part and parcel of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge really means not only know thyself, know thy past.
Well, this must please the historian very much.
Well, it pleases me, but on the surface a lot of things seem to happen that contradict this completely. You know, people think that we live in a revolutionary age.
Yeah.
People think that our young people are totally uninterested in tradition. People think that history is useless, or people think, you know, our universities are saddled with faddish history courses, or history courses that emphasize the very present. This will not last. I think this is one of the promising things, this appetite for the past, but it is only an appetite. An appetite has to be fed.
Does this mean the future has no appeal to you, no purpose to you?
Oh, not at all. It probably has something to do with the other human condition, that if you're too much afraid of death, you won't enjoy life. About the future, what can I say? I'm not a prophet, I'm a historian. There are two things that occur to me. One of them is what a great moralist once said, that things are never as bad or as good as they seem.
Right.
You know. The second thing is that Past knowledge, the knowledge of the past, while a very important thing, can be very badly misused. And a very odd intellectual habit, a very bad one in the 20th century, is to constantly look at the past of people and draw illegitimate conclusions from it. The ascription of motives of people. See, there's a difference between motives and purposes. Motives are the push of the past. Something in the past has happened with our hormones, with our genes, with our education, our complexes that push us. And we know really very little about this, and it's very wrong to psychologize about it. But purposes are something different. Purposes are this mysterious pull of the future that really makes human life function. Human life, in many, many ways, is the desire for more life. When this desire fades or dies, we die.
It's intriguing to me to hear a self-described reactionary, right-wing, old-worlder express implicitly a greater faith in democracy than a lot of people who call themselves Democrats, because what you're saying is the common man and woman is far more capable of thought, analysis, self-willed direction than he or she's given credit for today.
Well, I'm very glad you say that, because I have come to believe this partly, not exclusively, but partly because of my 40 years in this country. And not because of the institutions of this country, but because what I experienced in the character of so many Americans from different walks of life. I'm a believer of Edmund Burke, who really was a conservative, who said the people must never be regarded as incurable.
This has been a conversation with John Lucas at his home near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. I'm Bill Moyers.
SCTV is on the air. Well, not yet. It's really coming up next on Channel 5.
This program was made possible by a grant from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. For a transcript of this program, send $3 to A World of Ideas, Journal Graphics, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. Video cassette.
And you lose before. Tonight, a successful American playwright tells us how Bessie Smith spoke to his soul and his spirit, and why The Cosby Show doesn't. Join me for a conversation with August Wilson.
This program is made possible by a grant from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. A World of Ideas with Bill Moyers.
It's been a long road for playwright August Wilson, from a boarding house in Pittsburgh to the Broadway stage. Wilson worked in obscurity until 1984, when Ma Rainey's Black Bottom hit New York, his play about musicians who struggle not to sell out to white tastes.
We done sold Africa for the price that they made us. We done sold ourselves to the white man in order to be like him. Look at the way you dress. That ain't African. That's the white man. We're trying to be just like him. We done sold who we are in order to become someone else. We just imitation white men.
Well, what else are we gonna be living over here?
I'm Levy, just me. I ain't no imitation, nothing.
You can't change who you are by how you dress. That's what I got to say.
It ain't all how you dress, it's how you see the world, it's how you follow life.
It don't matter what you talking about. I ain't no imitation white man. I don't want to be no white man.
Beneath that drive to be someone, Wilson found bitterness.
God, take a nigger's prayers and throw them in the garbage. God don't pay niggers no mind.
In fact, God hates niggas. Hate them with all the fury in his... Jesus don't love you, nigga. Jesus hates your black ass. Come talking that shit to me, talking about burning in hell. Nigga, God can kiss my ass.
Wilson took that fury and created a powerful drama about fatherhood in his next Broadway production, Fences, starring James Earl Jones as Troy Maxson.
You eat every day.
Yes, sir.
Got a roof over your head.
Yes, sir.
And clothes on your back.
Yes, sir.
Why you think that is?
Because of you.
Hell, I know it's because of me. Why you think that is?
Because you like me?
Like you? I go out of here every morning and bust my butt, putting up with them crackers all day long because I like you? You're the biggest fool I ever saw. It is my job.
Wilson won the Pulitzer Prize for Fences in 1987. He is writing a cycle of plays to resurrect black voices from every decade of this century. For all his success, Wilson lives quietly in Minnesota. I visited him at the Playwrights Center here in Minneapolis, which supported his work early on and where he still feels at home. Your plays are set in the past. Joe Turner, 1911, Ma Rainey, 1927, Fences, the 1950s. Do you ever think about writing about now, about what's happening in your time in mind today?
I don't look at our society today too much. My focus is still in the past. And part of the reason is because when I do the wellspring of my art and what I do, I get from the blues. So I listen to the music of the particular period that I'm working on. And I think inside the music is clues to what is happening with the people. And I don't know that much about contemporary music. So if I were going to write a play set 1980, I would go and listen to the music.
And why were blues so important? Is it Ma Rainey who says that you sing the blues not to feel better, but to understand life?
Sure, the blues are important primarily because they contain the cultural expression, the cultural response to blacks in America and to the situation that they find themselves in. And contained in the blues is a philosophical system at work. And as part of the oral tradition, this is a way of passing along information. And in order, if you're going to tell someone a story, if you want to keep information alive, you have to make it memorable so that the person hearing it will go tell someone else. This is how it stays alive. So blues was a way of doing that, and the music then provided you with emotional reference for the information. And it was sanctioned by the community in the sense that if someone else sung the song, or other people sang the song, and they kept it alive because they sanctioned the information that was contained in it.
You remember the first time you heard the blues?
I do. Very specifically, I remember Bessie Smith. I used to collect 78 records that I would buy from St. Vincent de Paul store at 5 cents a piece, and I did this indiscriminately. I would just take whatever was there, 10 records, and I listened to Patti Page and Walter Houston, September Song. And one day in my stack of records, there was a yellow label record that had a typewritten label, which was kind of odd. And I put it on, and there was nobody in town could bake a sweet jelly roll like mine. It was by Bessie Smith, of course. And I listened to it, and I had one of those old 78s where you had to keep putting a needle in. Yeah. And I recall I listened to the record 22 straight times. I had never in my 22, and just over, I had never heard anything like it. And I was literally stunned by its beauty. It was very much different than Patti Page singing whatever she was singing. And it spoke. There was an immediate emotional response.
What did it say?
Well, it was someone speaking directly to me.
About
the fact that this is mine, and this is something that I can connect with, that I instantly, emotionally understood. That the rest of the music I was listening to did not concern me, was not a part of me. But this spoke to something in myself, and it said, this is yours.
You said earlier that music is a way of processing information. Yes. What was the information the blues brought to a kid named August Wilson?
One, that there was a nobility to the lives of blacks in America, which I didn't always see. I was at that time living in a rooming house in Pittsburgh, and after I discovered the blues, I began to look at the people in the house a little differently than I had before. I began to see a value in their life that I simply hadn't seen before. I discovered a beauty and a nobility in essence, what was their struggle simply to stay alive, their struggle to survive. The mere fact that they were still able to make this music, it was a salute it was a testament to the resiliency of their spirit.
You know, as you talk, I think of these black teenagers in the ghetto, Newark in particular, where I spent a lot of time filming a documentary for CBS. And I think of those moments in Joe Turner, when your play, when the characters are absolutely struck dumb because, as you wrote, they ain't got words to tell. Mm-hmm. And I think of those kids in Newark. They don't have words to tell their story. Mm-hmm. The blues don't speak to them. It's mainly rap. Mm-hmm. Do you think August Wilson could write a play about those kids?
Sure. I mean, we come out of the same tradition. We come out of the same culture. I haven't, as I was saying earlier, I haven't actually stopped to look at what is happening with them in their particular life. Yeah, but there's no question, because it's me also.
You were a dropout, like a lot of these kids in the ghetto today. Who reached you? Who brought the poet to life in you?
I think it was my mother. I mean, she's the one who taught me how to read. And also, reading was very important to her, because she stressed the idea that if you can read, you can do anything.
But if you could read, why did you leave high school?
I was bored. I was confused. I was disappointed in myself. I didn't do any work at the school until my history teacher assigned us to write a paper on a historical personage. I chose Napoleon.
Why Napoleon?
I had always been fascinated with Napoleon because he was a self-made emperor. Victor Hugo said that Napoleon's will to power. It was the title of my paper, and I submitted it to my teacher. And he didn't think I had written it. And he wanted me to explain to him, and I, had my bibliography and my footnotes, and I felt that's all the explanation I should give. And what the upshot of that was he gave me a failing grade on a paper. He had written an A+ on it or an E and said, I'm going to give you one of these two grades. And when I refused to prove to him that I had written a paper, other than to say that I had written it, he circled the E and handed it back to me, and I tore the paper up, threw it in his wastebasket, and walked out of the school. I was 15 years old, and I did not go back. However, the next morning, I got up and I went and played basketball right underneath the principal's window. And as I look back on it, of course, I wanted him to come out and say, why aren't you in school? So I could tell someone. And he never came out.
Do you ever go back to, what did they call it, the Hill? That was your area, the Hill in Pittsburgh?
Oh, sure, yeah.
What's happened to it?
Same thing has happened to most black communities. Most of it is no longer there. It's the buildings and what used to be at one time a very thriving community, all but a depressed community, but still there were stores and shops all along the avenue. They are not there anymore. When I left my mother's house, I went out into the world, into that community, to learn what it meant to be a man, and I still have family there. So I go back as often as I can. I go and I stand on the corner and say, yeah, this is me.
Have any of those people seen any of your plays?
They have, yes.
Do they talk to you about that?
They do. There are some of the guys on the avenue, people that you see just hanging out on the street. All I know, they don't really know what brought, they don't know anything. All I know is you did something. And they'll walk up and they say, hey, how you doing, man? We proud of you. It was the fact that someone from that community did something, whatever.
You once wrote, one of your characters said, everyone has to find his own song.
Yes.
How do these people find their song?
Well, I think they have it.
They have it.
They just have to realize that, and then they have to learn how to sing it. In that particular case, in Joe Turner, the song was the African identity, and it was connecting yourself to that and understanding that this is who you are.
As an African,
yes.
I mean, these people in Pittsburgh, you think must find the African that's in them or in their past before they really know who they are?
We are Africans who have been in America since the 17th century. We are Americans, but we are, first of all, we are African. There's no way that you can dispute the fact that we're African people. We have a culture that is separate and distinct from the mainstream white America's culture.
But friends of mine who go back to Africa say that they find themselves thinking and being treated as if they were American tourists.
Yeah, no question.
They're Americans.
Sure. Sure, and absolutely, and if you take these people I'm talking about, you take them back over in Africa, they walk around trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and there's no way that they can relate to that. You see, but the sensibilities are African. They are Africans who have been removed from Africa.
You know, the Jews in their Passover celebration always end by saying next year in Jerusalem. They have a fixed place, but what does it mean to next year in Africa?
Part of what our problem as blacks in America is one that we don't claim that. Partly, you see, because of the linguistic environment in which we live in. And I was in Tucson at a writers' conference, and I challenged my host to pull out his dictionary and look up the words white and black. And he looked up the word white, and he came up with things like white, unmarked by malignant influence, of desirable condition, a sterling man, upright, fair, and honest. And you look up the word black, and you get a villain marked by malignant influence, unqualified, violator of laws, etc. And these are actual definitions that are in Webster's dictionary. So this is a part of the linguistic environment, so that when white America looks at a black, they see the opposite of everything that they are not.
Some whites are saying today that for blacks in the ghetto to emerge into the mainstream of American life, they really have to become mainstream Americans. They've got to become part of the white culture, that you can't exist, you can't thrive in a mainstream culture unless you become like the mainstream culture.
Well, they hold up examples of the Irish, of the Germans. These are all Europeans who share the same sensibilities as the mainstream, so it's very easy for them to melt. But we cannot change our names and hide behind the label of being an American, because we're a very visible minority. You can look at us, you can see us coming a block away. So there's no way that we can melt into the power. Other races, for instance, the Orientals,
right.
They're allowed their cultural differences. You look at an Oriental, and they may do things very differently, and they participate in the world differently than Europeans do.
Chinatown in San Francisco is a tourist attraction.
Yes.
Harlem is not.
Harlem is not, yes. So, but it's because we allow the Chinese to have their cultural differences. Not only do we allow them, we salute them for it. You see, but blacks are not allowed. Blacks are expected to become like whites, without really understanding, in order to do that we have to turn our head around almost 360 degrees. You see, because our worldviews are so drastically different to begin with.
But if blacks keep looking for the African in them, if they keep returning spiritually or emotionally to their roots, can they ever come to terms with this dichotomy, with living in these two worlds? Aren't they always going to be held by the past in a way that is potentially destructive?
Oh, I don't say it's potentially destructive at all. In other words, to say that I am an African, that I can participate in a society as an African, that I don't have to become, I don't have to adopt European values, European aesthetics, European ways of doing things in order to live in the world.
What's your opinion then of the Cosby Show? Do you ever see the Cosby Show?
It does not reflect black America, to my mind.
In what sense?
Most of black America is in housing projects, without jobs, living on welfare. And this is not the case in the Cosby Show, because all the values in that household are strictly what I would call white American values. It would be hard-pressed to even you can search the entire United States, and I think you would be hard-pressed to find that family, despite the fact that there are some blacks who have, quote, made it, who have money and who own their own houses, for instance, who are not on welfare, who are educated, and who have responsible jobs. They actually make a very small portion of black America, most of black America, is crowded in the housing projects looking for jobs.
Well, I understand that, but again, back to the Jewish Passover, where the Jews pray next year in Jerusalem. Since Africans don't have a Jerusalem, don't they have to say next year in the American dream, I have a dream that I can make it in this country? Isn't that the Jerusalem for black Americans?
Well, maybe, but see, there's another part of Passover. And I was invited to one time, a friend of mine invited me. And I went, and I was struck by the very first words. And it starts off, we were slaves in the land of Egypt. You see, now that's the first thing, and then next year in Jerusalem comes at the end. But they were constantly reminding themselves of what this historical situation has been. So, you know, I think, for instance, I find it criminal in the fact that we, after hundreds of years in bondage, do not celebrate our Emancipation Proclamation, that we do not have a thing like the Passover where we sit down and we remind ourselves that we are African people, that we were slaves, because we try to run away, we try to hide that part of our past. We don't have that. If we did something like that, it would say this is who we are. We recognize the fact, one, that we are Africans, we recognize the fact that we were slaves, and we recognize that since we have a common past, we have a common future also.
You remind me as you talk of the fact that both Jews and blacks have been through such great suffering, and yet as they went into the ovens or onto the slave ships, they kept singing the song of the Lord. And when I think of that, of the faith of both peoples, I think of Levy in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Remember, he hears that a white mob has forced a black preacher to humiliate himself.
Yes.
And he cries out, where the hell was God when all this was going on? Mm-hmm. What's August Wilson's answer to that question?
Well, it was the wrong God that he was expecting to come and help him. I think, as he later points out, he answers the question himself. He said, because it's a white man's God. The fact that Africans, when they came to America, their religion was stripped from them, everything, their language, culture, ideas. When you look in the mirror, you should see your God. If you don't, you have somebody else's God. So, in fact, what we do is we worship an image of God, which is white. Right? Which is the image of the very same people. We're talking about image now. The very same people who have oppressed you, who have put you on the slave ships, who have beaten you and who have forced you to work, etc. The image was a white man.
So the God of the slave holder can't be the God of the slave?
Without question, no. It's two different things.
Well, the paradox for August Wilson, at least to me, if I can be personal for a minute, is you had a white father.
I did, yes.
And yet you chose the black route.
Because the cultural environment of my life was black. Because as I grew up, I learned black culture at my mother's knee, so to speak.
You didn't make a conscious choice. I'm going to choose black over white.
No, it's just who I always have been. The cultural environment of my life has always been the forces that have shaped me. The nurturing, the learning have all been black ideas about the world.
You see, when I went to Fences, I wept. I wasn't an outsider, even though it was about the black experience in America. I wept at the relationship between the father and the son, at the mother who was so loyal to a disloyal husband, at the importance of tradition, the role of the community. I wept. I was not an outsider there. I felt a part of that experience you were writing about, but you were writing about black Americans.
I try to explore, in terms of the life I know best, those things which are common to all culture. So, while the specifics of the play are black, the commonalities of culture are larger, the universalities in the play. So I think you were able to make connections with the fathers, because the play is, the specifics are black, but you have father-son conflict, you have husband-wife, you have whatever.
So you're not unsympathetic to those blacks who look at the Huxtables in the Cosby Show and see there something that they want, something to achieve. You're saying that's not the whole story.
It's not the whole story. And of course, everyone, I mean, you can go into Newark, in the ghetto of Newark, and you ask the people what they want. They want decent homes. They would like to be the Huxtables. This is what they want, but there are no avenues for them to do that. In order to do that, one, you have to deny it. White America, the social contract that white America has given blacks is, if you want to participate in society, you have to deny who you are. You cannot participate in a society as Africans. You can't come and bring that African stuff.
But the dominant commercial ethos in America is so strong that it seems to me, and there's so many more people who watch television than attend the plays, that it seems to me the Huxtables are winning the battle for the black imagination, and that the August Wilsons and the Troy Matsons and the Ma Rainey's are losing.
Yes, but you see, I think even blacks who sit up there and look at the Cosby Show, and while they may want to participate and share some of the wealth, say, of the Cosby, they understand that's foreign to their lives. That is not the way they socialize. They recognize it immediately as that's the way white people do that. But they would like to have that and still be who they are, and still socialize and do the things that they do. So they would probably go out and buy a big Cadillac because their sense of style is different. And it might be a yellow one or a pink one. And it's simply aesthetics. Basically, we do everything differently. But we still would like to have, you know, whatever rewards the society has to offer to someone who is willing to work and who has a talent to basically to sell.
You once said, Mr. Wilson, that the most valuable blacks were those in prison who had the warrior spirit, as you called it, in the African sense. Men who went out and got for their women and children what they needed when all other avenues were closed to them. Who do you think has the warrior spirit in America today? Who's fighting the battle?
I think those same people, for the most part. I think ever since we've been, since the first Africans set foot on the continent, there has been a resistance. And I think that this spirit is best exemplified in those, not necessarily all of them are in the penitentiary, but the ones, because of that spirit, they find themselves on the opposite side of the society that has constantly tried to crush that spirit.
I was going to suggest maybe the middle class, the black middle class, possesses that warrior spirit today, in the sense that they're struggling in a white man's world to make it, to provide for their children, to keep that house, pay that mortgage, send those kids to school, to live the life of responsibility. That there's a struggle going on there in the black middle class.
The real struggle has been since Africans first set foot on the continent, an affirmation of the value of oneself. And I think if, in order to participate in American society, in order to accomplish some of the things which the black middle class has accomplished, if you have had to give up that self in order to accomplish them, then you are not making an affirmation of the value of the African being. You're saying that in order to do that, I must become someone else. I must become like someone else. The example I always use is I was in the bus station in St. Paul, and I saw 6 Japanese Americans who were sitting down having breakfast. And I sat there and observed them, and they chatted among themselves very politely. And they ate their breakfast, they got up and they paid the bill. And they walked out, and I sat there. And I said, what would have been the difference if 6 black guys had come in here and sit down? What is the cultural differences? And the first thing I discovered is that none of the Japanese guys played the jukebox. So the first thing, when 6 black guys walk in here, somebody's going to go over to the jukebox. They're going to put a quarter in the jukebox. Somebody's going to come up and say, hey, Roddy, man, play this. And he's going to say, no, man, play your own record. You know, hey, I ain't playing with you. Don't play my record, man. Put your own quarter in there. The second thing I noticed, no one sent anything to the waitress. Now, 6 black guys go, hey, mama, what's happening? What's your phone number? Now, don't talk to him. He can't read. But give me a phone number. The guy's going to get up to play another record. Somebody's going to steal a piece of bacon off his plate. He's going to come back and say, man, who been messing with my food? I ain't playing with y'all. Don't be messing with my food. When the time comes to pay the bill, it's going to be, hey, Joe, loan me $1, man. Right? So if you were a white person sitting observing that, you would say they don't know how to act. They loud. They don't like one another. The guy wouldn't let him play the record. The guy stole food off his plate. But if you go to them 6 guys and say, what's the situation here? You'll find out they're the greatest of friends. And they're just having breakfast the same way the Japanese guys had breakfast. But they do it a little differently. This is just who they are in the world. They cannot not do it like that because that's who they are.
So you've answered my question. I was going to ask you, don't you grow weary of thinking black, writing black, being asked questions about blackness?
Oh, how could one grow weary of that? I mean, you never transcend who you are.
From the Playwrights Center in Minneapolis, this has been a conversation with August Wilson. I'm Bill Moyers.
SCTV is on the air. Well, not yet. It's really coming up next on Channel 5.